Welcome to the Future of Wellness, exploring self-transformation and holistic healing to unlock your inner potential. Hosted by Christabel Armston and Keith Parker.
Hello, welcome to this episode of the Future of Wellness. On this episode, we're featuring Jay Brown. For more than 25 years, Jay Brown has been developing techniques to teach people how to practice yoga in a deeper and more fulfilling way. Founder of the Abhyasa Yoga Center in Brooklyn, New York, which was open for 10 years, he's also a writer and industry-leading podcast host of Jay Brown Yoga Talks. Jay came to yoga by way of his mother's death in an attempt to reconcile his grief and find a path to health and wellness. His journey through various styles of yoga included the power and intensity of Ashtanga and the alignment of Iyengar, but despite achieving proficiency, he found himself stuck with chronic pain. While traveling in Rishikesh, India, Jay found a special teacher in Swami P. Saraswati, who taught that yoga practice was not a linear progression, but rather a process of learning how to take care of oneself. Ultimately, Jay found his way to an entirely therapeutic orientation in the tradition of T.K.V. Desikachar and T. Krishnamacharya. He currently calls Easton, Pennsylvania his home, and he teaches both online and locally. Jay, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so we shared a little bit of your bio there in your journey to yoga and this hinge point around your mother passing away. There's this general idea that pain and suffering leads us to look for something more. Maybe you could open up with something about this pivotal shift for you.
Sure. I don't know if I would frame it the way that you did, that pain and suffering is the thing. I would say I had a specific experience, like a deathbed experience with my mother. The last time I saw her, she didn't pass in that moment, but that was the last time I saw her, and she didn't leave that bed after. That moment with her when I was 16 years old, I can kind of draw a line from that moment to everything else that I've been doing with yoga and my own sort of spiritual seeking and inquiry, that something happened in that moment that I couldn't explain and didn't even totally acknowledge until later on, and wanting to understand what that experience was. And to your point about the pain and suffering, I would say the grief, like reconciling loss, and the loss of my mom certainly was the impetus for me to want to live in a certain way. And I would say that before that happened, it went the other way. Like after my mom passed, things got really bad for me. And I did get to a point where I considered taking my own life. It got that dark. And in that moment, I had made a promise to my mom in that experience on her bed that I was going to do great things in my life and make her proud. And I don't know why I knew I said such a thing, because at that time I was like 16 and I was like a super hyper kid, and I was not like at all aware of my feelings or anything. I was like a crazy ADHD 16-year-old, although they didn't have that diagnosis back then or whatever. And in that moment, there was like some kind of clarity came over, and I said that to my mom, and I made that promise to her. And then in the moment later in my life, when I was at my darkest point, that's what became the overriding thing, that I couldn't do that I had to find some other way to live. And yoga practice became the vehicle for that. I was living in New York City. It was like the early 90s. Yoga was pretty unknown still very counterculture move, but I started going to classes at Jivamukti Yoga Center on 2nd Avenue, and it was like the coolest place ever. It was so awesome. There was a real diversity of people there teaching and studying. Teachers were making these meccas to India and studying with these gurus, and then coming back and like setting up altars on a storefront location underneath the Thai restaurant. And then the practice there was quite serious. I got really into it in New York, and yoga was just kind of exploding, or it was even just before it really exploded into the mainstream, where if you were like an artist living in the Lower East Side, like I was in an apartment that cost $400 a month, then you could go to yoga classes and kind of engage with what was at that time still very rooted in like Eastern mystical traditions. It hadn't become more of a fitness thing yet or very popular. So I wanted to understand death and my mom's passing and what my purpose was in life. And some of the teachers I found there were talking about those sort of things. So I do think that there's a certain amount of like pain that goes into why someone cares about this stuff sometimes, or often I talk about it like people have an in, you have your own personal in to yoga, and it's usually very personal. And sometimes it's like some tragic thing that happened or some particular experience that you had that made you realize there's something bigger than the material or something. And those experiences seem to really be what spur people towards yogic inquiry. And it certainly was true for me.
I'd like to rewind a little bit, Jay, in your personal journey, about some of the different styles of yoga you move through, the different schools, as it were. And I wonder if you could explore a little about this shift. We mentioned the Ashtanga yoga there in the bio and the Iyengar. What was the journey or the purpose in your seeking and moving between those styles? Or were the moments where you recognized that your mindset had just shifted and you were looking for something else?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, as I mentioned initially, I got into yoga because I just was like messed up inside and I needed to figure out how to be alive and not feel crappy. And, the styles of yoga practice that came here to the West, and you named them, there was three big ones. There was Shivananda, there was Iyengar, and there was Ashtanga. And Shivananda was probably the most soft in terms of its approach physically comparatively to the styles, but there was a guru and a lineage tradition, and I was not interested in that so much. That felt culty to me, so I wasn't into that. And the other styles, the Iyengar style and the Ashtanga style, they had their own distinguishing characteristics as well. And everybody hybrids everything now, but back then, what gave you credibility as a teacher was like citing your teacher, and you were basically associating with a particular lineage or approach. Like that's what gave you some credibility. But it was at that time where people had studied with several different teachers at that point, and then they were starting to combine things in their own teaching. And initially I gravitated towards Ashtanga Vinyasa because if you think that there's something wrong with you, I think being really hard on your body sometimes makes perfect sense. It did to me. Like I thought I was broken and I need to be fixed. And so that really intense, strong practice. And back then, there was no consent card chips or any of that stuff that we got nowadays. It was way hardcore. People came up and cranked you into stuff. And if you couldn't do it, you got sent to the back of the room. It was a different scene in terms of Ashtanga. And I ended up studying with a teacher who wasn't like strict Ashtanga because I actually didn't like that. I didn't like getting up at 6 a.m. every day except moon days to go to the Ashtanga Shala. So I found a teacher named Allison West, who's somewhat well known in New York, and she had studied with Patabi Joyce, but she had also studied with Mr. Iyengar, and she'd also studied at the Shivananda Ashram. She had a previous incarnation as an art historian, so she kind of had a mind of somebody who was very like held all this information and could cite stuff and was like comparative analysis of the different approaches, and I really liked that. She was really hardcore though. They used to call her like the yoga Nazi back then because she like didn't play at all. But I liked that too. I liked that she was kind of kicking me in the butt. So I studied with her for a while. I was into the Ashtanga until I hurt my knee. I kind of blew out my knee doing like Marichasana D or whatever. And it was the first moment for me where like I was already teaching and kind of starting to make money at it and pay my rent from it, and then like blew my knee out and I realized like I need this knee to work in order for me to like do this job. If this is a job now, this knee has to function properly. So I can't do things in yoga class that makes it like super yogi can't walk. So I went to teachers at that time and asked them about my knee injury. And frankly, it wasn't a time where teachers were being real transparent, or like the dynamic was still kind of coming out of guru disciple traditions, even though they weren't gurus and we weren't disciples. So the dynamics were funky, but you'd often get kind of platitudey answers. And the platitude answer was, you need to have better alignment. So I set upon studying Iyengar more, did some stuff at the Iyengar Center, found another teacher who taught Iyengar alignment, studied out with Allison too, and was able to kind of like do stuff like physically, and was able to do level 4 poses or whatever. But there was a very significant moment there where I was often being asked to do demonstrations in class at a certain point. And I was asked to do a handstand demonstration in a class. And I did this handstand, this press handstand that I had worked up. And everybody applauded me after I did it. And the teacher said, "This is what you're working towards." And like right in the moment that the teacher had said that, I was feeling super good about myself. I was like, I'm the only one in the room who can do it. And I felt very accomplished. But like on the way home, it was like, I couldn't have been more miserable. I was still so messed up inside about my mom. And like all the initial reasons why I got into yoga, like I gotten better. I was like disciplined. I was eating good foods and like living a healthy life. And I was like going to yoga class every day and teaching yoga and like kind of like embracing it as a lifestyle. But the approaches in practice were all about the asana. Mostly we were bringing it to the mainstream, and that's what everybody wanted. And that's what we were getting. And at a certain point, I remember I was walking home from that class and I said, if this is what we're working towards, we're screwed. It's got to be more than my ability to do mediocre gymnastics. And that's when I like almost like broke up with yoga or whatever. I was like, I don't know if yoga even is legit. I don't even know if it really is what they say it is. And that's when I took this trip to India, which you referenced in my bio. And I just went with a friend, not to study, but just to travel around and try to find a guru maybe and see if I'm supposed to keep doing this yoga thing or not. And I did end up meeting that Swami, and he literally lived up in a cave most of the year and came down during the raining season to teach. He had studied at the Bihar school, which is a very famous school. And then he had spent time with Rajneesh before it was Osho. He spent time with him. And he didn't speak great English, but he taught me this super important lesson. He like did these super simple exercises with me that seemed totally boring and like nothing to me. And then he would ask me how I felt. He would say, "How do you feel?" And I would talk and talk and talk and try to sound smart and never answer the question because I had no idea. No one had asked me, "How do you feel?" In the years I had been studying and people were asking me to do demonstrations and all of this, it was never like, how do you feel? And then how did what you just did make you feel right now? And it kind of turned it. He was coming from what you were pointing to earlier, this other standpoint where there's no linear progression. Like I thought I was supposed to follow these 8 limbs of the ladder and climb and do my asana and do my pranayama and do my meditation so I can get to the samadhi, and then I'm not going to have pain anymore and I'm going to feel okay about my mom and everything. And he was saying, no, 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 there's nowhere you need to get to. If you're trying to get somewhere, you're probably screwing it up. He was sort of saying it's on a need to do basis. I'll never forget, like one day after being with him for several days, he had asked me this question, how do you feel? And I kind of snapped at him and said, I don't know. And he was so happy. And it was this moment where I realized like I hadn't been answering his question. He kept asking me the question and I just never was answering until that moment I realized, oh my God, I have no idea how I feel. I have no idea how I feel about anything. I feel about my mom or my practice or anything. And the cool thing is he kind of recognized that. it seemed. And the lessons changed. And they, after that, he would say, what do you want to do? And eventually he would say, let's go get pizza. And he would take me to get pizza in India because there's no pizza in India, but he was like showing me something about yoga. He was showing me something about yoga, that yoga isn't this trying to get somewhere like you're not there. Yoga is a thing that you do when you need it so that you feel okay, so you can be with your friends and be in your life in this good way. It was what I come to recognize much more of a tantric approach of integration, of you go inside, you touch space with that deep harmony of the cosmos that's within you, and then you come back to here with that, and it expresses itself in your attitudes and your actions. And that idea was like, okay, that's how I, as a Westerner, can utilize this. It's not me becoming a monk or no longer having sex or taking this kind of ascetic path, but it's this integrated householder path. And he gave me permission. He said, you practice by yourself and you decide how you feel and you find the practices for that, rather than like following some kind of like arbitrary thing that's being dictated. So I got home from that trip and started doing self-practice only, like stopped going to group yoga classes and started only practicing by myself at home. And I had permission from a guy, Swami I met in India, who told me that I get to decide what I want to do and what I don't want to do. And I just started throwing things out. Like if I can't find a good reason for it, I'm not doing it anymore. And I just kind of came up with a practice that's this very simple program of like essential breathing and moving practices. Ultimately, as you mentioned in my bio, inspired by T.K.V. Desikachar. I should mention that the teachings of T.K.V. Desikachar specifically are what enabled me to have the self-practice that I came up with. And ultimately, that's what I teach now. It's sort of like a program of practice that can be utilized for someone to find their own practice. It's not meant to be a practice that you follow, but something that you could potentially utilize to develop whatever the facility is for you to find what you need to find, you know?
I love that story, Jay. I find it so interesting that that entry point was the feelings, just getting in touch with the inside, because that is so focused on what Christabel and I do. And, the word healing immediately puts us in touch with that, like what's going on inside. And the language we use is things like, establishing your center and being present within yourself, and then being in touch with what are the feelings, what is going on in the mind, emotions, etc. And then from there applying whatever is most appropriate to learn how to like harmonize in peace, but from that resource of the oneness, the resource of that union within. So I think that that's really amazing, honestly. Very inspired in hearing you share that. Your journey brought you through these different stages really organically, and it brought you to a place of approaching yoga in a more gentle manner, as you're describing. And you even brought in this teacher, T.K.V. Desikachar, who is not on that list of the famous teachers. Like, yes, on some level, but like you said, like B level, C level, whatever. He's not an Iyengar, he's not a Patabi Joyce, but he's very, very significant, especially his teacher, Krishnamacharya. Could you speak a little bit about that tradition? And specifically, how does that then, how is that informed, or like, could you describe more of this gentle yoga approach that you're talking about? Why does it work? How have you landed there in a sense in terms of how it's applying to people and you're seeing its results?
Yeah, there's two parts to that. There's like the TKV Desikachar approach, and then how that's sort of translated in what I'm doing into my gentle is the new advanced thing that I've been putting out there. So first to the other part, to Desikachar teachings, I think that there's a couple of significant distinctions. I don't know who's listening to this or how familiar they are. Those other teachers that we mentioned, Patabi Joyce and Mr. Iyengar, their teacher that they cite is T. Krishnamacharya. And T. Krishnamacharya was the father of T.K.V. Desikachar. And initially, as I understand it, Desikachar wasn't all that interested in the family lineage business. He went to engineering school and then later on became more interested. Some people tell the story that it's because yoga started to become more of a thing, and these other teachers were saying, I teach the yoga of Krishnamacharya. And Desikachar thought, well, that's not what my father taught me, what they're teaching. And he was compelled to start to be a yoga teacher himself. Now, that's one particular idea out there. There's others. I don't want to say that's the only way to frame that history, but basically what happened is Desikachar became often the teacher to the Westerners who started to come. Like Krishnamacharya was getting older. He taught some of the early Westerners like Indra Devi and like some of these folks who first came, got to meet Krishnamacharya directly. But as he got older and Westerners continued to came, Desikachar became the person that Krishnamacharya was saying, you'll study with my son Desikachar. And Desikachar also met the Krishnamurtis, J. Krishnamurti and Yuji Krishnamurti, so he had relationships there. But Desikachar wasn't dressing in traditional robes. He was wearing more Western clothing, and his presentation was much more accessible, I think, to Westerners. And what he was saying is that the practice adapts to the individual doesn't adapt to the practice. And he was saying that you need to make this relevant to you in your culture, not necessarily try to adopt mine. And it was rooted in a self-practice tradition that was taught one-to-one. So you met your teacher, you had a teacher would sort of give you a practice to do that you did on your own. And then you would come together, and it was rooted in relationship. It was rooted in a relationship between the teacher and the student. And it was a one-to-one thing. And he had a clinic. I have some people coming on my show to talk about the Krishnamacharya Yoga Mandiram. They had a clinic where they were treating people with what people call yoga therapy now. A lot of what people call yoga therapy now was rooted in things that Desikachar was doing with practice, helping people with specific conditions. So when I became exposed to his practice, it was very empowering because it's much simpler and it's truly breath-centered in terms of like the gentle approach, getting to the other side of it. There are a few technical distinctions, which were really my intuit more than the philosophical ones initially, was, you know, in a Ashtanga practice, they'll often be leading Ujjayi Pranayama in the vinyasas. But the pace of the movement is such, and the way that it's being led is such, that the breath is secondary to the movement. You're kind of moving with the flow, maybe getting your heart rate up, maybe kind of getting into more of a flow state in that kind of way that you might when you go running or something, which I'm not knocking. I'm not saying that's a bad thing at all. But then we're maybe doing some ujjayi on top of that. And often there's no inhalations. Like it's all sthira, no sukha, because nobody's got an even smooth inhale when they're like pressing up from chaturanga to up dog on that 108th sun salutation or whatever. So Desikachar was just inhale your arms up and exhale your arms down. And so the physicality is so simple. It's not meant to be the challenge. The challenge is, can you bring your attention away from everything else inwards to your breathing? Can you have your attention and your breath be together? Can you maybe have your breath longer and smoother without struggling? And can you have the movement of your body be totally synced to that? So your attention, your breath, and your body movement are all becoming like one and the same thing. And you're doing that with a quality of sthira sukha, of balanced effort. So it's alert and engaged and strong, but it's not straining or struggling. There's easefulness and receptivity to that. So that kind of like basic technical thing kind of flipped it for me. And I was like, wow, that's really challenging. That's way more challenging than me doing 108 jump back sun salutations right now. It was hard for me to have your attention be directed and kept in that way. That fixing and then releasing. There's stops. You see, there's little stops and rests in Desikachar practice too. Like you do a thing and then you stop and you let go of it. And then you do the thing and then you stop. It's not go, 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 and then collapse in Shavasana at the end. It's a fixing and releasing of attention, which becomes like an exercising of your concentration muscle, right? And that exercising of a concentration muscle equals you getting to have more say about what your mind does some of the time, which is actually worth a lot. And I'm going to add, for me, it isn't just about you having this facility with mind. It is also about a relationship to Ishvara. I sort of have to say that because for many years, I just stopped there. I stopped where we were just at, where it's just about you having the facility with your mind to kind of have more of a response to what's happening in your experience rather than reacting to everything. And that's true, but it's also about your sensitivity to your experience, as you were pointing to, Keith, and the work that you're doing. Like, it's why a lot of yoga teachers are into somatic movement modalities right now, because they are pointing to that too. The ability to have your own ability to sense for yourself what your experience is, to know it for yourself, not from like an intellectual analytical way that's been given to you by a book, but from you actually putting your attention to your experience. So I don't know if I answered the question, but for me, at a certain point, I'm not interested in using the physical practices to kind of like do strength and flexibility, or even like challenge ourselves. Like, I've come to do other things for that. Like, I do some weight bearing goblet squats and push-ups and things that I like to do because I'm like 52 and my body needs things that it didn't need when I was in my 20s and 30s. But I don't do that in my asana pranayama practice. Like, my asana pranayama practice, very specific role it's playing for me. And the idea of it being gentle, I've struggled to find the words because, you're trying to like categorize what you're doing is always a problem. But for me, gentle means setting a boundary and then working within the boundary that you set. So on days that you feel good, you might challenge yourself more, and it would be a beautiful thing and you get a benefit. But on days you're not good, if you do that again, the same way you did on the day you feel good, on the day you don't feel good, you don't get the same results. In fact, I learned you'll deplete yourself quite quickly if you do that. So it's about that sensitivity to have a sense, which isn't always that easy, of how you're doing, and then to have a discipline, which is to just do the thing for that, not as much as you possibly can every time, no matter what, or you're lazy, but just a right amount for today.
A brief pause to thank you for listening to this episode. If you're looking to take the next step in your transformation, find out how we can support you with our popular energy healing training, one-to-one private sessions, free resources, and more. Visit energyfielddynamics.com to learn more.
It's really fascinating to hear you talk about this and the energy with which you're sharing it. It relates so much to a lot of the principles we teach and share. Whether yoga is the name of the modality or energy healing, it's an irrelevance. There's a lot, as you say, there's a lot hidden in this term simplicity, because as you say, there's far more complexity in what you're inviting people to do and to reach for in that practice, as I understand it, in your sharing, than say that pushy, more sort of practice orientated, routine orientated asana. I love the way in which you're sharing. This seems as if it's a truly holistic practice in the original sense of that word, encouraging that and deepening that mind-body connection, and really inviting people to be in their sovereignty and to effectively sort of empower themselves to take on their own understanding of what it is they're thinking and experiencing in that invitation between exploring breath and movement in this incredibly conscious way. And as you're describing it to me, it sounds like movement meditation practice, and again, in the real true sense of the word, that people are able to connect to, perhaps as you did, Jay, in that powerful moment you shared earlier, where that teacher that Swami was able to reflect to you, in that seemingly very innocent question: how are you feeling? What are you feeling?
Yeah, I think hearing you say that, I like the way it sounds. There are folks out there like myself who have been practicing for long enough and kind of gone through the ringer of over pushing their bodies or whatnot, and still there's transformative experiences that happen through practice that still lead one to continue to be inspired to inquire into it. And we call it the contemplative aspects of practice sometimes, for lack of better words. And yet there is a challenge because it did come into the mainstream. And there is now like an expectation or an idea about yoga practice that people come in the room with. People don't come in with the same kind of like just always honest inquiry. Like there's all these expectations. And I say, because I'm like having to decide right now as I'm opening this center, what am I going to write on the little card that's going to be out there? Because there's some people I know, but the majority is that there's a good amount of foot traffic. So people are going to walk by and they're going to grab that card and they're going to say, oh, look, a new yoga center opened up. What's the yoga that they do here? And they're going to look at the card. It's got to say something for my class. And I'm like, right now, I'm like, should it be gentle flow? I'm like trying to come up with the words because I don't want people coming thinking they're going to get something that I'm not going to meet. I'm not going to meet that expectation. And at the same time, I do have a rent now that I have to pay. So you can sell more yoga classes. I know this for a fact because I've researched the marketing of these things over the years. It's been like kind of something I'm interested in too, like how yoga gets marketed. And you can have lots of different flavors and yin and call the class strong and restore or or you come up, there's ways to market yoga where I could definitely get the classes probably fuller quicker. But it would be bringing people in with an expectation that I'm not actually interested in that. And in the past, we'd say, just get them in the door, give them 10% of give them 90% of what they want so you can give them 10% of what you think they need. And I'm kind of like, no, the percentages are off. At this point, I'm happy to meet people where they are. That's what Desikachar taught. But I think that there needs to be a place for yoga that is about the contemplative aspects from the start. Not let's get them in the door with the hot classes and then hope it becomes something more later. So trying to find a way, it's easier to sell handstand workshops than it is subtle inquiries into the nature of your existence, But what I've come to is we're in a time where maybe it's not about selling it anymore. And it's not about me as a teacher and my charisma anymore. It's actually about a place in my neighborhood where people could come to have a certain experience that you don't actually get at other places. There's not yoga does and healing modalities like you guys are offering too. These kind of spaces that we're offering for people, you don't get that in other places. I wouldn't have come to any of the stuff that I've come to if there wasn't a yoga class for me to go to. And so I do think that there's almost like a renewed purpose for me personally, a renewed reason to try. And you know what? I decided to try, and then I wrote a blog post about how scared I was that I did this, and I did a fundraiser, and I asked for help, and I raised $20,000 so I could open this yoga center from 260 people. So I feel like right now there is really good reasons to try. To try to do some stuff, to try to have reasons that people come together in these rooms and breathe and move together with this kinds of intentions and kinds of questions,
Something I think that's often missed in the West is the actual meaning of the word yoga. As I understand it, it's derived from a Sanskrit meaning, to join, to yoke, to unite, that stem word in Sanskrit. And we can think of yoga as this practice to lead to the union of individual consciousness with that of universal consciousness. So this harmony, mind, body, spirit. And I wondered if you could talk about this a little. You mentioned India there. I was actually in a classroom in India where the Iyengar teacher at the time asked this question, what does yoga mean? There were 40 students there, the majority of which were Western, and only one person had this definition, this answer, which was a really pivotal moment for me in understanding how the Western mindset is engaging with yoga, perhaps as opposed to the traditional Eastern modalities.
Well, it's an interesting question that you're asking. That is what initially drew me to yoga and Eastern practice, is that Eastern spirituality seemed to have this much broader wisdom-based culture of understanding. Like you said, like the yoking of an individual consciousness to a universal consciousness. So I do think that there's something there. However, I'm going to qualify it only because more recently I have kind of been exploring Western spiritual traditions in a way that I never did before, and kind of even learning from how there's like totally Eastern mystical Christianity and Western Christianity, and there's like a lot of stuff there. So I don't like to kind of say East West so much anymore because I don't always know what we're saying when we say that. I do think that there's a kind of Western frame that most of us were born into, which is very materialistic and reductionist. The idea of there being something, like I said, more than the material, or what energy healing is based in, is based in a certain consciousness-based reality that you're pointing to, that a lot of kind of Western cultures or certain scientific paradigms don't even allow for. So I do think, as a Westerner who then embraced these traditions of Eastern spirituality, that has been kind of a bit of an obstacle. Now, I will say this idea of universal consciousness has changed for me. I have had wonderful opportunity to talk to an incredible range of viewpoints, and really came to understand like what a spectrum of belief and viewpoints the umbrella of yoga holds. You have atheistic yogis and totally theistic yogis, and there's all this in between, and they've been debating it for years. So for myself personally, for a long time, I definitely gravitated towards like a radical non-dual conception, which it seems like you were sort of pointing to. I'm not sure. I don't know where you're coming from, but the idea of there's an interconnectedness and a oneness of all things. And so that universality that you're pointing to, a universal consciousness, we have access to it. And yoga and other healing modalities often are a way for people to kind of tap into that for healing and guidance and all kinds of meaning. And I think over time, more recently, the recent question I've been asking, though, is there's an experience of oneness and a universal consciousness, but I have also had an experience of what I don't know what to call other than God, of like a creator, where it's not just an impersonal universal force, but it's actually more of like a creator being that you are in dialogue with. And I've certainly found this within yoga. Like there's people who teach Ishvara Pranidhana, meaning giving yourself over to a universal consciousness, and people who teach Ishvara Pranidhana as no, you actually get down on your feet, the Lord of your creator. And it is interesting because it is more what we would typically think of as religious, which I have rebelled against my whole like adult life. Like I rebelled against the hypocritical Judaism of my parents growing up in the 80s in Los Angeles, where we went to the temple and everybody had all these like expensive jewelry and costumes on. I'm like, it was such bull. But I think that for myself now, I've had some experiences over the last few years, to be perfectly honest, that made me had to confront the question of where do moral codes come from? Like certain non-dual tantras teach a kind of like randomness almost, or a certain kind of without God. If there's not like a God, an omnipotent, omniscient God, then we are God. And when we are equating ourselves to God, I've become very uncomfortable with that, because I feel like there's something much bigger than me that I feel a need to be in service to, and it's not me. The words point to things, and I'm trying to be clear about what my experience is, and trying to relate to others and what their experiences are.
Really appreciate that. Very transparent response. There's just layer after layer after layer of schools of philosophy. And on some level, the question is just, if there is a singular truth, then that's just the truth. We just don't know. Who knows? So bringing things back down to planet Earth, very much so.
Please do, Keith.
Which I really loved what you were saying about that scene in New York in the 90s. In your case, I was there like really 10 years later. there really was a thing happening. New York was a hotbed of it. Not maybe not the center in the world, but New York had a great scene. I'm curious, as you've been involved with that scene for such a long time, how has the landscape of yoga kind of changed, and how are you seeing people and schools and teaching adapt? Like what has been that, what's your perspective on that adaptation and evolution in the past 25, 35 years?
I would say that there is before the pandemic and after the pandemic, because I came into it in the early 90s and there was like a trajectory, a very clear kind of trajectory of yoga coming into the mainstream. And I came into my adulthood along that wave. Like I caught that wave, not at the earliest time, but relatively early in it. And that's why I was able to have a yoga center for 10 years and have been able to essentially make my living and have a wife and two children as a yoga teacher. Now, I don't know that that is even possible in the same way now as it was back then. Yoga was a very obscure thing, it was a counterculture move when I got into it. If I was at a party, I always say this, I was at a party at that time and someone said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm a yoga teacher." They would say, "What's that?" They didn't know. Nobody knew what a yoga teacher was. Nowadays, if you say that, they'll say, "Oh, what kind of yoga do you teach?" Like everybody knows there's all kinds and stuff. So back then, it was much more of a counterculture move. Eventually it started to blow up and there was just all these opportunities. I was teaching lots of classes at lots of different little centers. I had private students. It was a very kind of thriving time to be a yoga teacher because it wasn't as saturated. Now, at a certain point, it did start to become an industry. That is what was happening before the pandemic. I do think the pandemic completely decimated everything and reshuffled everything. Like nobody really knows what's going on right now. I think there is a move now to try to get back in person because we all went online. However, I think what happened was is we all saw a huge boom like 2021, 2022. Some of us had a huge boom. Everything went online. And we were like, wow, for a second, we thought, can I make a living online only? Like, is that even possible? And it was possible for like a year and a half. And then at a certain point, the Zoom fatigue set in, and understandably so. I got it. I'm trying to find things to do that mean I'm not on a device. And like the discipline required to do that these days is needed. So I get it. There's a problem and like a rebalancing that's had to start happening after everything was a Zoom meeting for a while. To have like a physical space became important again. I swore it off. I was like, we don't need spaces. We'll do it in our living room. But now, like, to have a place that you go to that feels a certain way and that you decide to make part of your life. Like when I had the center in Brooklyn, those first years, it was a really golden time and people made it a place that they went to and friendships were formed and, like some community happened around that. And I feel a deep, deep need for that again. So I think I'm not the only one who's feeling that way now.
Jay, I really commend you for sticking with your integrity. And there's, whilst you've spoken a lot about, the financial and practical things that come to a person who takes on like a career in something that isn't about commerciality at its base, right? But it's actually really about well-being and truth and honesty, not selling and numbers and those kinds of things. And when we take on those roles as being careerists in things that are not really set up in the commerce that our society has, it's a really challenging push and pull, and it's really understandable. But for people to, like yourself, to take that risk and to stick with your integrity means everything to the foundation of what you're representing and what one is doing when being in their integrity, when offering something from a place of honesty without, being so attached to what the return is, whilst there needs to be some level, just being willing to go with it regardless. And just really commend you for that. And you said this landscape has been shaped up tremendously Christabel and I really understand that as well. Things are very different post-pandemic, like you said. Everything kind of got put into a blender and spit back out on the other side, and a lot of people don't know what the future looks like in all these different ways. And in person seems like a great thing, and what you're offering seems to be of really great value. And we wish you the best, obviously, with your new center. If people want to find you, where and how do they do that?
It's very simple. You go to jbrownyoga.com, everything's there.
Where's the center that you're opening up if people want to know? And do you have a name?
Yeah. If you are in anywhere near the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania, I am in Easton, Pennsylvania on College Hill. It's at 327 College Hill. There is a website. It's kind of still coming together. It's called thebirdhouseyoga.com. And you can go there if you want to, if you're going to be in Easton. But really the place to find all of my stuff is jbrownyoga.com.
Yeah, thanks, Bray. And a special shout out there for the J Brown Yoga Talks podcast as well, which is industry leading.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I would say that for me, that project has become so fulfilling and rewarding. Like through these periods of time, like you go back in the archives, because one element of the show is me talking to these other people and learning from them, but it's also just like me trying to work through stuff. And I started that show right as like I knew I wasn't going to be able to release on the yoga center. And there was like all this like Instagram yoga like happening and this like hashtag every damn day. And everybody thought yoga teachers were living these glamorous lives. And here I was, started out in my 20s, and here I'm now in my 40s, and I got 2 kids and a pain in my hip. And I'm like, this isn't the glamorous thing everybody's talking about. So one of the elements of the shows is just actually talking about stuff that yoga teachers don't always talk about, and bringing folks on without giving them any questions, because that's kind of a thing where yoga teachers have scripts, and a lot of times I want them to I want people to learn about them, and I've used some of my script with you today, but a lot I purposefully was off script because I think it keeps it more real. So by not having pre-written questions, I'm looking to bring about something that we couldn't have planned. And so for me, that has led to like a lot of great learning. It's been my continuing education. And I think I've learned so much from doing the show. It's a great pleasure and passion.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. It's been an honor.
Oh, really? My pleasure. Thank you guys again for having me.
Thanks for being a part of the Future of Wellness. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review. It helps us reach more people and to make great episodes like this one. Learn more about field dynamics and why we think the future of wellness matters. Check us out at energyfielddynamics.com. See you next time.